To Kill a Mockingbird, Chapter 11. When I was well into the second grade at school and tormenting Boo Radley became passé, the business section of Macomb drew us frequently up the street past the real property of Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubose. Jem and I hated her. If she was on the porch when we passed, we would be raked by her wrathful gaze, subjected to ruthless interrogation regarding our behavior, and given a melancholy prediction on what we would amount to when we grew up, which was always nothing. "Hey, Mrs. Dubose! Don't you say hey to me, you ugly girl! You say good afternoon, Mrs. Dubose!" She was vicious. Once she heard Jem refer to our father as Atticus, and her reaction was apoplectic. A lovelier lady than our mother never lived, she said, and it was heartbreaking the way Atticus Finch let her children run wild. Countless evenings, Atticus would find Jem furious at something Mrs. Dubose had said when we went by. "Easy does it, son. She's an old lady and she's ill. You just hold your head high and be a gentleman. Whatever she says to you, it's your job not to let her make you mad." The day after Jem's 12th birthday, his money was burning up his pockets, so we headed for town in the early afternoon. Jem thought he had enough to buy a miniature steam engine for himself and a twirling baton for me. It was then my burning ambition to grow up and twirl in the Macomb County High School band. "And what are you doing in those overalls? You should be in a dress and camisole, young lady. You'll grow up waiting on tables if somebody doesn't change your ways." "Come on, Scout, don't pay any attention to her. Just hold your head high and be a gentleman." "Not only a Finch waiting on tables, but one in the courthouse lawn for N-words." "Your father's no better than the N-words and trash he works for." I had become almost accustomed to hearing insults aimed at Atticus, but this was the first one coming from an adult. On the way home, Mrs. Dubose was not on the porch. And years later, I sometimes wondered exactly what made Jem do it. Jem had probably stood as much guff about Atticus lawing for N-words as had I, and I took it for granted that he kept his temper. He had a naturally tranquil disposition and a slow fuse. At the time, however, I thought the only explanation for what he did was that for a few minutes he simply went mad. "Why'd you do it?" "She said you lawed for N-words and trash." "You did this because she said that?" "Yes, sir. Son, I have no doubt that you've been annoyed by your contemporaries about my lawing for N-words, as you say, but to do something like this to a sick old lady is inexcusable. I strongly advise you to go down and have a talk with Mrs. Dubose. Come straight home afterward." "You don't care what happens to him. All he was doing was standing up for you." "I never thought Jem to be one to lose his head over this. Thought I'd have more trouble with you." "Well, son?" "I cleaned it up for her and said I was sorry, but I ain't. Atticus, she wants me to read to her. She wants me to come every afternoon and after school and Saturdays and read to her out loud for 2 hours. Atticus, do I have to?" "Certainly." "But she wants me to do it for a month." "Then you'll do it for a month." "Atticus, it's all right on the sidewalk, but inside it's all dark and creepy. There's shadows and things on the ceiling." "That should appeal to your imagination. Just pretend you're inside the Radley house." "Mrs. Dubose? So, you brought that dirty little sister of yours, did you? My sister ain't dirty, and I ain't scared of you." "Mrs. Dubose, are you all right?" "It's time for her medicine." Atticus had 2 yellow pencils for me and a football magazine for Jem, which I suppose was a silent reward for our first day's session with Mrs. Dubose. Jem told him what happened. "Did she frighten you?" "No, sir, but she's so nasty. She has fits or something. She spits a lot." "She can't help that. When people are sick, they don't look nice sometimes." "She scared me." The next afternoon at Mrs. Dubose was the same as the first, and so was the next, until gradually a pattern emerged. Everything would begin normally. That is, Mrs. Dubose would hound Jem for a while on her favorite subjects, her camellias, and our father's N-word loving propensities. She would grow increasingly silent, then go away from us. An alarm clock would ring, Jessie would shoo us out, and the rest of the day was ours. Her fits passed after a time, and she was in every other way her old self. "Jeremy Finch, I told you lived to regret tearing up my camellias. You regret it now, don't you?" "I certainly do." "Thought you could kill my snow in the mountain, did you? Well, Jessie says the top's grown back out. Next time you'll know how to do it right, won't you? You'll pull it up by the roots, won't you?" "I certainly will." "Don't you mutter at me, boy. You hold your head up and say, 'Yes, ma'am.' Don't guess you feel like holding it up, though, with your father what he is." That'll do, and that's all. Goodbye to you. It was over. We bounded down the sidewalk on a spree of sheer relief, leaping and howling. The spring was a good one. The days grew longer and gave us more playing time. Jem's mind was occupied mostly with the vital statistics of every college football player in the nation. I'm going down to Mrs. Dubose for a while. I won't be long. We had not seen Mrs. Dubose for over a month. She was never on the porch anymore when we passed. What you want? She's dead, son. She died a few minutes ago. Oh, well. Well is right. She's not suffering anymore. She was sick for a long time. Son, didn't you know what her fits were? Mrs. Dubose was a morphine addict. She took it as a painkiller for years. The doctor put it on it. She'd have spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary. Sir? She said she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. She said she meant to break herself of it before she died, and that's what she did. She still disapproved heartily of my doings, and said I'd probably spend the rest of my life bailing you out of jail. She had Jessie fix you this box. Oh, hell devil, why can't she leave me alone? Shh. I think that was her way of telling you, everything's all right now, Jem, everything's all right. You know, she was a great lady. A lady, after all those things she said about you, a lady? She was. She had her own views about things, a lot different from mine, maybe. Son, if you hadn't lost your head, I'd have made you go read to her. I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, and you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. But you rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. Dubose won all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and nobody. She was the bravest person I ever knew.